We are about to get into it, guys. We are getting into the story of the most infamous serial killer in American history. His name is John Wayne Gacy. And this is his story. Let's go and check it out. This is from the book, The Scariest Serial Killers by James Richmond. Let's go and check it out, y'all. Thumbs up, man.
Son. It was St. Patrick's Day in Chicago, 29 minutes after midnight on the cold spring night of March 17th, 1942. Edgewater Hospital on the north side welcomed a brand new baby boy into the world. The father was 41-year-old John Stanley Gacy, a Chicago native, American soldier and machinist. He was a World War I veteran and married to Marion Elaine Robinson. They named their new bundle of joy John Wayne Gacy, after the American film star. They hoped their son would embody the epitome of masculinity. The parents left the hospital, and upon returning home they introduced the baby to his sister, Joanne, who was only 2 years old. After another 2 years went by, the Polish family welcomed another baby, this time a girl named Karen. John grew up in a safe neighborhood on Chicago's north side. His neighbors did not struggle for money. The houses on the block were well maintained, with grand yards full of vegetable gardens and well-maintained flowers. Nearby railroads ran east and south toward the city. For John Wayne Gacy, he remembered the bits of childhood with fondness. He recalled his first memory of taking the train to visit his aunt and uncle. Another time he remembered walking out of the house in the front yard naked, too young to even care. Everyone laughed endearingly at the sight of young John's indecent exposure. Summer nights were spent running around outside catching fireflies or sneaking into neighbors' yards to be chased away. But behind the veil of nostalgic memories, darkness loomed like a shadow. John Wayne Gacy was never enough for his father, an alcoholic who worked all day as an auto machinist and came home to drink before supper. The family waited and heard the heavy footsteps as John Stanley Gacy emerged from the basement, coming up the stairs. God forbid if any of the children misbehaved. Any sign of disobedience was met with a beating from the razor strop kept hanging on the wall. Its presence was a foreboding reminder to the three children. His father was not shy to hit his children with the makeshift whip, and his vile anger could switch on at any moment. The three children learned to toughen up against the wrath of their father, especially John, who would not cry as John Stanley beat him. The children experienced plenty of abuse from their father, but Marion often took the brunt of her husband's aggression. The greatest danger was that the episodes of anger could be spontaneous, or without any catalyst. It was a warm summer night. John was only 2 years old, and the family sat around the dinner table for their supper. Marion was back home with a 3-week-old Karen. "I don't know what triggered it," she said. Without any reason, John Stanley became blinded with a violent fit of rage. He whipped a plate of food at Marion. Then he rose from the table and struck her face with enough force to knock the bridge of her teeth out. Screams erupted from the three young children who watched in horror. Blood gushed from Marion's face as she ran out of the house into the night. Her husband chased after her. During the chaos, a neighbor rushed out to defend Marion and shouted, "Don't hit her again! I'm calling the police!" With his gun in hand, John Stanley stormed out of the house and disappeared for several days. Marion gathered the children and left to stay at her brother's. After several days, Marion finally made the decision to return home. The plate of food remained stuck to the wall where her husband had thrown it. She cleaned the mess that she did not create, and prepared her husband's favorite dinner, boiled meat and potatoes. When he returned, they ate dinner and carried on as though John Stanley had not attacked his wife only a few days prior. Marion sought ways to explain her husband's violence. She blamed his blow-ups on a benign brain tumor, even though the doctors told her it did not affect his temper. It was a rationalization she used for the rest of her life to explain John Stanley's erratic behavior.
And he was a schizo, and that's why his son was a serial killer, because he was a schizo. You know, his ass is crazy.
She thought when he started drinking, his brain would swell up and the tumor created pressure. He couldn't help it. The abuse John Stanley gave was not limited to random outbursts. He berated his son constantly and called him a sissy. It began when he was only 4 years old. John was out in the garage with his father, who was working on the car. He was only a small child and managed to scramble a pile of car parts on the floor. John Stanley erupted into a fit of anger and beat his son, spewing lines of insults. A flood of violence poured forth, all because of a few pieces of metal shifting position. It was clear early on that John was unlike the other boys. He was a bit strange and a loner. Born with an enlarged bottleneck heart, John couldn't participate in sports with the other neighborhood boys. He was sickly, weak, and overweight, even at a young age. All more reason for his father to look down upon him. John Stanley's only son was soft. Hidden from his father's spiteful eye, the young John spent his time hiding underneath the front porch where his father built a sandbox for him. There he spent his time. While other boys played sports and raced around outside, John remained tucked away from the rest of the world, letting his imagination take over.
Wow.
According to Gacy, it was at this young age he experienced his first sexual assault. An older girl from the neighborhood on Opal Street coerced him away from his home to a prairie hidden away from the watchful adult eyes. There in the tall grass, she took advantage of the little boy. Not knowing any better, young John lay helpless as the older girl fondled him. When he told his parents, they began to shout and fight with one another. Only 3 years later, it was 1949. John, 7 at the time, was with another neighborhood boy and the boy's younger sister. It all may have started as innocent playing, but the playing progressed until it became unsettling. All the children became naked.
What?
John recalled how he and the boy messed around sexually with the younger sister.
No.
When his father found out, he was beaten with the razor strop. Around the same time, John Stanley had a contractor friend who took a liking to Gacy. The family friend invited Gacy along in his truck for rides to construction sites. For a 7-year-old Gacy, these drives were terrible.
What?
He dreaded them. While he enjoyed building and construction, his father's friend would wrestle with Gacy.
Oh, Lord.
The playful roughhousing usually ended with Gacy's head pinned in the man's crotch, his face pressed against the men's rugged work jeans. John Stanley's friend was messing around with Gacy the same way Gacy had with the little girl.
Jesus.
But Gacy felt personal shame about what the contractor did, and never spoke about the strange wrestling matches.
Oh my God. I was like, wait,
He feared his father would become angry and think he was a jagoff or a fruit picker. There was nothing more John Stanley hated than gay people.
Oh, Lord.
At home, John's behavior may have clued his parents off to the concerning and peculiar sexual experiences he was exposed to in his early childhood. While Gacy was still around 7 or 8, John Stanley and his wife Marion were getting dressed to go out. Marion opened her underwear drawer to find every piece missing. The parents searched for the weird disappearance. The garments were not in their room, nor the laundry. Eventually they found them stashed away. Their son had stuffed it all in a brown bag and stuck it beneath the porch. He claimed he had no clue why the underwear was hidden away in his sandbox when questioned later. His parents continued to interrogate him until Gacy finally claimed that he liked the feel of it. Rather than address the obvious issues, John Stanley pulled the razor strop off the wall and began to beat his son. The fetish with underwear surfaced when he was younger, but Gacy never stopped stealing his mother's underwear. Marion made a point never to mention it to her husband again. Perhaps she was trying to keep her son safe from his father's unforgiving rage. She saw how John Stanley treated her baby boy. She witnessed how her husband screamed and beat her child. Marion's maternal protection could have led John to become a mama's boy. He stayed close to her and loved her dearly. He was safe with her. John's parents may have tried to counteract the strange behavior they saw in their child by enrolling him in Catholic school. Maybe in their eyes, a religious influence could help shape him into a moral, normal person. He attended the school with his sisters until the age of 11. The Gacys moved around this time, and so John Wayne Gacy began to attend public school. For the most part, he was a well-behaved student. He kept himself busy. In the mornings, he worked a newspaper route, and in the evenings, he had a part-time job at a grocery store. The new house was larger and positioned closer to the Chicago proper. In the dark basement, John Stanley spent most of his time. To John, it was his father's sacred place, a place kept hidden with several locks. Only his father held the key. Hidden away in the downstairs cave, John Stanley drank and became angry. At times, the family heard shouting. It was John Stanley speaking to himself from the depths of the house. As an outstanding rule, no one ate supper until he was ready. He would return to the surface accompanied by aggressive stomping up the stairs. Emerging from the basement, he was eager to argue with anyone. He'd holler at his young children, call them dumb and stupid. "If my father said the sun wouldn't rise tomorrow," John later described, "you couldn't disagree with him. He'd argue you into the ground. But when I was young, I didn't know. I argued with him, and he'd holler at me, tell me I was dumb and stupid, arguing with little kids, and every time he had to win. Never wrong." To further the distance between father and son's relationship, John's health conditions restricted him from participating in any sports. "So I was a disappointment to my dad," John said, "because I was weak, and he was strong. He hated the weak person, even in emotions. We'd go to funerals for someone in the family, and he'd never get tears in his eyes. At a party, he'd never laugh. A strong, somber individual. Emotion was a weakness. Physical illness, even when it couldn't be helped, was a weakness.
Wow.
I remember once he was so sick he couldn't get out of bed, and Ma finally called a doctor. The doctor said, 'How long have you been like this?' My dad said, 10 days. The doctor said, 'Why didn't you wait another day and just call the undertaker?'
Wow.
And it turned out my dad had pneumonia.
Oh, wow.
John's father was a callous and cold individual to everyone in his family. His behavior created an uncertain environment for everyone in his home. His wife and children experienced the worst of his behavior and abuse. But Marion continued to insist it was the tumor's fault. And the same year of the move, John went out to play on the swing. He must have lost control or was being a little too wild, as children do, and smacked his head hard on the metal pole.
Oh.
Hard enough to black out. His body fell from the swing onto the ground. From that moment forward, John began to suffer from episodes of blacking out.
Jesus.
Suddenly he would pass out for 10 minutes at a time. After many visits to doctors and hospitals, there was no clear answer. No explanation. But to John Stanley, his son was merely faking to get out of school. The child was too weak and used a simple head bump as an excuse to be lazy. That's all it ever was to John Stanley, a way for his son to get out of situations. When John stopped attending the public grammar school where he was failing, he moved to a vocational school. There he surpassed the other students. He did so well in science that his teacher encouraged him to stop attending class and work. He ran errands for the teachers and did office work. Among the staff and students, he gained a reputation for being well-dressed. His clothes weren't expensive, but the outfits were well thought out. He was neat and orderly. Even his sister's girlfriends noticed how tidy he was. They'd laugh and say he kept his room better than their own. He wasn't able to be a part of any sports with his classmates, but he was the civil defense captain in high school. Usually, boys his age thought about companionship and meeting girls. Gacy did not share their enthusiasm to couple up. Instead of dating, he continued pursuing his work. He started his career in Chicago politics as an assistant precinct captain to the Democratic candidate for alderman in the 45th Ward. His father disapproved. Politicians, to John Stanley, were scum and crooks. He called his son a fool, but John disagreed and continued to work his ass off. John recalled, "Maybe it was a way to antagonize my dad, in part, and maybe it was a way to get acceptance. I was always looking for acceptance because my dad made me feel that I was never good enough. John Stanley's approval for his son never came. The lack of support might have reinforced Gacy's habit of comparing himself to the other boys in his classes and age. They were muscular, athletic. John wasn't. As a teenager, he stood 5 feet 8 inches and was nearing 200 pounds. He was unhappy with how he viewed himself. It was around the age of 16 when John dwelled on death often. His Catholic...
Anyway, y'all, we're going to get back to part 2 of this. This is the story of John Wayne Gacy, infamous serial killer. We're going to come back with part 2 a little bit later on. But what do y'all think about this book so far? Scariest serial killers. It's pretty good. I like the guy who's doing the reading. The book is by James Richmond. So what do y'all think? Leave it in the comments. Subscribe to Charles on as well. I'll catch y'all on the next one. Take care.